Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at environmental context in nature and in the lab. There are a total of 6 learning objectives for this lesson. First, by the time the lesson is done, you're going to be able to discuss some of the ways in which environmental context can influence behavior. Second, you're going to be able to summarize Darwin's theory of natural selection and explain how it relates to understanding behaviors. You've probably thought about natural selection previously in terms of physiological elements, but we're going to think about it in terms of behaviors. Third, explain the concepts of proximate and ultimate causes of behavior. And related to that, be able to analyze a behavior using Tinbergen's 4-question framework. That may not make sense to you right now, but by the time you're done with the lesson, that will make sense. Fifth, summarize the studies with rats on the influence of enriched environments and discuss what these studies tell us about the influence of environmental context on animals' brains and behavior. And then finally, I want you to critically discuss the potential influence of our modern environments on the human brain and behaviors. These last 2 objectives are going to be based mostly on the reading. I'm going to talk about them briefly in the video. Let's start with the idea of context. Context is the circumstances that surround a given event, the unique interactions that exist amongst our behavior, our brains, our external environment, and our internal environment. Context matters when we're trying to explain behavior, when we're trying to explain biology, we're trying to explain the interaction between them. So imagine this. A person is falling through the sky. They were shoved out of an airplane or they fell off of a tall building. There's going to be a behavioral response, a physiological response to that by that individual. By somebody who's observing that, you're going to have a physiological, an emotional, a psychological response. But imagine someone falling out of an airplane in this situation. A very different context. Same thing, they're both falling, but now the context is different. The behavioral components are going to be different. The physiological responses of the individuals, physiological responses and emotional and biological responses of observers are going to be different in both of these cases. So context matters. When we talk about the effect of context or environmental context on behavior, we can talk about it both in terms of short term and long term. In the short term, this is what Ernst Mayr called proximate causes of behaviors. These are the things that, for example, our internal environment. Hormonal secretions, for example. Depending on your hormones, you may feel hungry, you may feel less hungry, even no matter how recently you ate. That's part of your entire internal environment. External environments can also influence behavior. So a loud noise can cause you to jump, or the presence of food. Even if you didn't think you were hungry, all of a sudden now you feel hungry and you start eating. So these are what we call short-term or proximate causes of behavior. But behaviors can also occur over much, much longer periods of time. And behaviors are influenced by evolutionary forces. So let's talk about Darwin's theory of natural selection, the beginning of our modern idea of what evolutionary forces look like. In this theory, there are 4 key concepts. The first foundational concept is variation. That is, if you look at a population of individuals within a given species, there's natural variation in some characteristics. So in the finches that Darwin was famous for studying, there were variations in the shapes or lengths of the beaks. In this example, hypothetical example here, there are variations in the color of these bugs. The second key concept is that there's competition. That is, there's overproduction, that any given ecosystem is not going to be able to support all of the individuals of within a population that could be reproducing. This means that there's going to be competition amongst offspring, competition for limited resources. And this leads to the idea of selection. That is, that some of those individuals are going to have characteristics or traits that are more suited to the particular environment in which they live than other individuals are. Those individuals now are going to survive. That can mean, this can come in many forms. This might mean they survive because they were better suited for finding food. Maybe they're better suited for avoiding predation, whatever it happens to be. Now, a key concept here in selection is that it depends on the environment. A trait that is adaptive in one environment will not necessarily be adaptive in another environment. And then finally, what allows this to change behavior over time is the idea of reproduction. That is, the individuals who have a trait that is more suited to the environment, more adapted, are going to reproduce at higher rates than the individuals who aren't. They're going to be more likely to survive. They're going to be more likely to reproduce. That trait then gets passed on to their offspring. Over time, what that means is that the trait that is more adaptive spreads through the population, and now you have a higher proportion of individuals that have that adaptive trait than you did before. This is the basic idea of natural selection. Now again, you mostly probably think about this in terms of physiological or anatomical traits, but they are not just anatomical traits. First, it's important to remember that anatomical traits influence your behavior. So in the case of Darwin's finches, the shapes of their beaks and interacting with the environment shapes the behavior of what kind of food they eat. But there are also behavioral traits that are not purely anatomical. And some of these are behavioral traits that are heritable and can be passed on. So these are traits can be adaptive or non-adaptive, and therefore they can also be subject to natural selection. This leads to the idea of what Ernst Mayr called ultimate causes of behavior. From an evolutionary perspective, we're going to look at what are the long-term evolutionary causes of the physical and behavioral characteristics. And that's something that we're going to consider at different points for different kinds of behavior that we'll analyze in this course. Related to the idea of proximate and ultimate causes is the set of 4 questions that Tinbergen laid out for when we're analyzing behavior, animal behavior. And these cross with proximate and ultimate, but also cross with when we're looking at things. Are we looking at a single snapshot in time, or what's called a single form, or are we looking at a sequence, a story, or over some period of time? So let's look at the first cell here, the idea of a mechanism. So when we are asking a question about a behavior, what triggers the behavior in the short term? What is the proximate cause for this behavior right now? Loud noise, boom, that was the stimulus. That stimulus triggers a response in a receptor. That receptor then sends signals to the brain. What does the brain do with it? How does that cause the person to jump? What's the mechanism of what happened? And we can trace that in the physiology and the neurological reactions that an organism has to a stimulus. But we can also look at a behavior in an individual over a period of time. So let's say loud noise, now another loud noise, another loud noise, another loud noise. Over time, that individual may start to habituate. They may respond less and less and less. Their behavior can change. In what ways is their behavior change? Is this a learned behavior, or is it a behavior that's not learned? Some behaviors won't change over time. They're not learned behaviors. Some will. So this is the development or ontogeny question. In addition to these proximate questions about the how, we can also ask questions about the why. These are the ultimate causes. And this again can be a snapshot in time looking at for a given individual or a given group of individuals who engage in a type behavior. We can ask, what is the function? What is the adaptive value of this behavior? How, if at all, does this benefit the animal, benefit the individual, and increase the fitness? What are the costs and benefits? So that's looking at a snapshot in time. And then we can look at the evolution question, and over long periods of time, the sequence of the development, how did that behavior come to be in the population in the first place? So these are 4 questions that we want to ask when analyzing behavior. So let's try an application of this. Let's say that you look down, you see a spider crawling across your foot, and you immediately jump up and you scream. Now let's ask the questions. What was the proximate cause of this behavior? What stimulus triggered the behavior? What biological processes happen inside your body? That is the mechanism question. We might also ask, has this behavior changed over time? Let's say instead of just seeing that one snapshot, we observe that you jump in response to spiders all the time, or over time you jump more and higher. So now we're looking at the development of a behavioral response. In addition to these proximate causes, we can also ask about ultimate causes. Does the jumping and screaming in response to a spider increase your fitness? If so, how? That's the function question in Tinbergen's 4 questions. And then we could also ask, how did this behavior evolve? Can we find evidence of other species? Can we find evidence if we look back at our own species, that people jump in response to spiders? And so now you have the set of 4 questions. All right, so now that we've done that, let's talk a little bit about environment and in the lab. One of the most famous sets of experiments was a series of experiments that were conducted by Diamond and colleagues in the 1960s at the University of California, Berkeley. In these studies, they had rats that were placed into enriched environments and rats that were placed into standard environments and rats that were placed into isolation, or what you might call substandard environments. Now, it's important to realize that at the time, the conventional wisdom, the key thinking was that the brain developed really early during the first couple, during the period that for any given animal of development, for humans during the first year or two, for rats during the first week or so. And then once an individual reaches adulthood, that the brain stops developing. Well, what Diamond and colleagues showed was that's not true. That over time, looking at an adult animal who is now placed in an enriched environment versus an adult animal that was placed in an impoverished environment, there was a change in the structure of the brain. Those in enriched environments developed thicker cortices, a thicker part of the brain where the neurons that allow us to think and respond are. They had more connections within that cortex than did rats in a standard environment. There were a series of experiments. This is just one experiment, a whole series of experiments that showed this. And this kind of work continues today. So, for example, in 2001, a study that looked at the recovery from stroke-related events. So they had animals that were artificially given a lesion that would simulate a stroke, and then placed in either an enriched environment or a standard environment. And then they were tested on their ability to kind of be able to stay on this rod that would move. And you can see the data are very clear. We don't have error bars, we don't have fancy statistics, but if you look at the original source, you can find that. It's very, very clear that the animals that were placed in the enriched environment recovered their score at a much higher rate than did the standard environment, showing that the brain is plastic, that it changes even in adulthood. And work on this continues. And in fact, the author of your textbook last year did a kind of cool set of studies where they taught rats to drive. Yep, that's right, you heard that right. So if you, well, I can't watch the video apparently, but you can watch the video by clicking on the link. And if you do, you're going to find that, yes, they indeed taught rats to drive. If you want to find out more about that, the PowerPoint that I have on D2L gives you links for a interview with with Dr. Lambert, as well as an article. And if you're interested in learning more about Marion Diamond, who conducted the seminal studies on environmental enrichment, and then she later went on to actually study Einstein's brain. She's been a pioneer in the field of neuroscience and biological psychology. She passed away 3 years ago, but recently there was a brilliant documentary that was done that's actually on Vimeo, so you can click on that link and watch that video. So where does this leave us? Well, we've seen that behavior can be triggered by short-term changes. It can be triggered by or influenced by long-term changes. Our environmental context influences our behavior. We can see that in rats. We can see that in other species. What about our own species? Just think about how much the environmental context has changed in our own lifetimes. For me, I'm getting close to 50 years old, and I've gone from where computers were something that you existed. You might have one computer in a building. I took typing class on a typewriter, to the fact that we carry around these computers in our pockets and we just call it a phone. That's just in our lifetimes. What about the last 100 years, the last 500 years, the last 1,000 years, the last 10,000 years in which our species has been on this planet? How much has the environmental context changed? How does that relate? How does our current behavior line up with those evolutionary contexts, those environmental contexts? Something to think about. So I encourage you, as you read the material in the textbook and as you kind of think about this question, what are the influences what are the proximate causes, what are the ultimate causes of our own behaviors? And how are these going to be influencing human brains and human evolution as we go forward? Okay, if you have any questions about this lesson, please let me know. Of course, you can send them by email. You can post on the discussion forums or on the team site for the class. Thank you.